So tonight we start with Brisk, and we're going to study Hilchas Tefilla and Krias Shma in a shir that the Rav gave for the yahrzeit of his father, which is Gimel Shvat, many, many years ago. And the Rav is analyzing a sugya in Masechta Brachos about a case of Safek Kara Krias Shma, Safek Lo Kara Krias Shma. He doesn't know, did he recite Krias Shma, did he not? Should he go ahead and recite Krias Shma? Another case that the Gemara addresses is he has a Safek if he was mispalel, if he wasn't mispalel. And Rabbi Yochanan says, Valavai, she's palel kol yom kulo. There's no inhibitions about adding an extra tefillah. So in the worst case scenario, he was yotze already with the first tefillah that he forgot, and now he prays the second tefillah. In my opinion, says Rabbi Yochanan, let him daven the whole day. Now the Gemara comes to
this is if he
has stopping. So he has stopping. He doesn't know. I don't know if it ever happened to you. It happens to me quite often. Did I daven? Did I not daven? You know, especially if there's a change in my program. I don't remember when I daven.
And it doesn't matter which tefillah. Shachris is probably hard for that to happen.
Yeah,
right.
But Milcha Marav it could happen.
Yeah, Milcha Marav, but happens a lot.
Yeah.
Now the Gemara comes to the conclusion the following: that although Rabbi Yochanan advocates in favor of davening as often as you want, halavai pal adam kol yom kulo, he can say a zillion Shmon Esrei in one day, but nevertheless, the Gemara says that anytime he adds a Shmon Esrei, that's not a chova, but rather a dava, he has to be mechadish badavar. He has to change the Shmon Esrei. He has to add his own personal tefillos. However, if he's in a situation of safek, he doesn't know whether he davened or whether he didn't daven, then he should daven, and that's how we paskin, like Rabbi Yochanan, and he doesn't have to be mechadish badavar. So Rav Soloveitchik asks a whole slew of questions on this Gemara, but we'll focus right now on one of those questions, namely, why is it that in a tefillas nedava you need to be mechadish badavar? You have to add some special tefillah. But in the case of Safek Ispal, Safek Lo Ispalel, there you don't have to be Machadish Badam. Now, based on this, the Rav asks another question on a different sugya in Brachos. The first sugya that we saw was on Daf Chaf Aleph. Now we fast forward to Daf Lamed Aleph, which is on the bottom of your page. And he says that the Gemara derives from a pasuk in Daniel that a person should daven 3 times a day and not more than 3 times a day. Now, this is very odd. First of all, if we're talking about an extra tefillah that's not obligatory, again, if you're talking about a tefillah nedava, fine, you'll be mechadish b'dava, that makes it into a tefillah nedava. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a case where he's going to daven a regular classic daven, Shmon Esrei. He's not going to be mechadish b'davar. He's not going to change or alter or add to the Shmon Esrei, and he wants to daven 4 times, and he's only obligated 3 times. So Rav Soloveitchik is very, very bothered by this. He says, let's say, for example, a person ate a meal, and after he ate a meal, he benched. Can he bench another time? He already fulfilled his obligation. If he would now use a bracha after he's no longer obligated, that would be Motzi Shem Shamayim L'Shav. You can't even entertain the possibility that a person would bench twice for the same meal. Why? He's already fulfilled his obligation. And once having done so, it's a bracha levatola, bracha shenetzrich. I mean, you have to know all the gedarim here, but certainly not permitted. And yet, with regard to tefillah, the Gemara has a havamina that I can daven a 4th tefillah, again, even without adding anything to that tefillah, although I was already yotze my chiyuv, and I daven 3 times a day. And the Gemara has to prove from a pasuk that he's not allowed to add an extra tefillah. Zimnin tlosa. What was the havamina? Why would tefillah allow me to add another tefillah, even though I already fulfilled my obligation? Whereas in Birkas Hamazon, it would be a bracha shenetzrich would be a violation of bracha if I were to add a Birkas Hamazon when I'm not obligated.
Maybe there's a difference between Birkat Nenen and Tefillah.
Well, again, we're not talking about Birchas Hanenim now. You're right. Birchas
But it's still-
Hanenim
but
is a
it's still-
separate
it's still
category. We're
response
talking
to-
about a bracha after
Okay.
It's
Moshe.
still response that you're Sovea and there's an obligation based on that.
No, but I'm in the mood to thank Hashem a second time around. The poppers were so great that night. That I came all the way from Dagan to Zion to hear Rabbi Bersan Shir to eat the poppers. So now I benched. I want to bench again. I want to thank the Almighty a second time around. No one would allow you to do that.
It's triggered by what triggers you to have to bench is the eating of a meal, right?
Right.
Tefillah, you can always say tefillah tash. You can always do tefillah, even without the confines of what we call Shmona Esrei. There's no limit to how much.
I hear what you're saying, but again, just like you're involved in a bracha she'eina tzricha because you don't need to make that bracha, in Shmona Esrei you have no less than 19 brachas.
There's no. What I'm saying is, there's nothing that. What's the?
Again, we're talking about Tefillas Chova, not about Tefillas Nedava. Again, if you talk about Tefillas Nedava, so Rabbi Yochanan says under certain conditions, Alavai Sheispal Adam Kol Yom Kulo, a zillion Shmona Esreis. But he's talking about a Tefillas Chova. Instead of 3, he decides he wants to add another Tefillah without a Nedava. What do you say? No. To make it in the Dava, you have to change the whole Tefillah.
Oh, because it's a change.
You have to be Mechadish Badava. He's not willing to be Mechadish Badava. He wants just to add another Tefillah. And the Gemara thinks he can until we quote a pasuk in Daniel that teaches me Zimnin Tlasa, only 3 and no more than 3. So the Rav has a breakthrough shita here, and he wants to know, in the case of Tefillah, what do we start with and what do we end with? Let me explain. In general, whenever you talk about mitzvahs, you start with what's called a chovas gavra, and then you end with the mitzvah. The kiyum mitzvah is a result of the chovas gavra. So first comes chovas gavra, and then comes kiyum mitzvah. Tefillah is the exception.
How does that chovas gavra?
In other words, I ate a meal, I'm obligated to bench. Now I do a mitzvah and I make the bracha. The chovas gavra makes the mitzvah into a mitzvah. It's only a mitzvah because I have a chovas gavra. Like for example, netilas lulav. If I already took the lulav, how you doing, Gedayo? Good? And keep your coat on. It's a little chilly. I say the plus here is that you can't fall asleep, even if I'm boring as sin. Okay, so if I take a lulav, I already fulfilled my chiyuv. Does it make any sense to take a lulav a second time around? There's no ma'aseh mitzvah of netilas lulav if I don't have a chovas gavra. So again, this chronology is first you start with the chovas gavra, and then you end by generating a ma'aseh mitzvah. You ate a meal, you're obligated to bench. The Birkas Hamazon is a kiyum mitzvah because of the chovas gavra.
So you're a chova to daven 3 times a day.
So Rav Soloveitchik says that basically tefillah is different. Tefillah doesn't start with the chovas gavra. Tefillah starts with what he calls a chefza shel tefillah. I don't know if we've ever gotten a chance to discuss this concept of a chefza shel tefillah, a chefza shel Krias.
We did when we discussed whether you forgot. Remember when we put Chol to Shabbos and Shabbos to Chol, whether you could
There
say
were 2 elements of the davening.
We discussed this, and we discussed the concept of tefillah.
So in any event, this is the real original. This is the source of all sources for the concept of a chefza shel tefillah. He says the following: the Mishnah in Avos, that's at the end of this major paragraph on page Lamed Tes, says Rabbi Shimon Omer, Havizoyer b'kriyat Shma u'b'tefillah u'kshatam mispalel al tas tefiloscha keva el rachamim v'tachnunim lifnei hamokom. So what does it mean a tefilas keva, and what is the opposite called a tefilas rachamim v'tachnunim? So Rav Soloveitchik, based on various sugyas, comes to the following conclusion. Tefilas keva means a tefilah shel chova. A tefilah of rachamim v'sachnunim is a tefilah that comes from the fact that I need the tefilah, I need the rachamim, I desperately need HaKadosh Baruch Hu's tachina. And Rav Soloveitchik explains that this is based on the fact that the Torah says Kikel Chanun v'Rachamu Erech Apayim v'Rav Chesed v'Nachem al Ra'ah. HaKadosh Baruch Hu loves us, and he grants us grace and compassion. And because we have the opportunity of rachamim and tachnunim, that means it's got to come from within. It's not something that comes from the outside. It's not what you call kafalem shame, meaning that somebody bludgeons me and obligates me and I have to fulfill the will of the king because he mandates that I do so. Ein chovas gavra kovas atfilu. It's not like every other mitzvah where the chovas gavra sets up the mitzvah. And when you say Asher Kinshanu Mitzvosav V'Tzivanu, what you mean to say is that now I'm aware of the fact that I'm obligated, Asher Kinshanu Mitzvosav V'Tzivanu, and now I'm going to implement the mitzvah. But in Tefillah, that's not how it works. In Tefillah, what should motivate the Tefillah and set up the Tefillah is tachanunim, is rachamim. And therefore the Chefza Shel Tefillah is a Chefza Shel Rachamim. Now listen how the Rav applies this. Noshim are women obligated in Tefillah. So the Gemara says the following, that Noshim chayavos b'Tefillah, why? This is on page Mem. De rachme ninu. Wait a second. Tefillah 3 times a day is a classic case of what? It's a Shma Garama. So what's rachme ninu? And nobody understands this Gemara. Rav Soloveitchik says that the chiyuv of the person starts not with the Chovas Gavra, but rather with the Chefza Shel Tefillah. Anyone who could create a Chefza Shel Tefillah, Memela becomes obligated in Tefillah. Do you see where the lines, the arrows go in opposite directions? In all mitzvahs Torah, the arrow goes from the Chovas Gavra, so everything starts with the Chovas Gavra and ends with the Maisa Mitzvah. The Maisa Mitzvah is registered, is meaningful, and it gets its Chalul Shem and its status only because of the Chovas Gavra. If there's no Chovas Gavra, then it's not a Maisa Mitzvah. But the exception to that is going to be Tefillah and Krias Shma. Because in the case of Tefillah and Krias Shma, we start with the Etzem HaChefza, meaning the entity of Tefillah. What sets up the entity of Tefillah? I don't need a Chovas Gavra. If I was only measuring Chovas Gavra, then first of all, I'd have to have in mind that I'm fulfilling God's chova, if you hold mitzvah srichas kavana. And here the Mishnah in Omer says, no, al task es tfilos lokeva. Don't be mispal because of the chova. Don't daven because you're obligated to daven, but rather daven because of rachmim v'tachnunim. Says the Rav, what does that mean because of rachmim v'tachnunim? Because you have the opportunity of setting up a Chefza Shel Tefillah.
And that should be unlimited.
And that should be unlimited. And that's the Havamina why, we'll have to see the Maskana, but why the Gemara thinks that even though I fulfilled my obligation, I've davened already thrice, I can still get up and daven again, because I still have the power within me, to create a Chefza of Tachanunim, a Chefza of Tefillah.
Does the Rav speak about, I mean, might be a little out of context of what we're doing, the scope of what we're doing now, but does he speak about how a mitzvah that's generated by my own feeling to daven took on structure that makes it look like a mitzvah that's on the God?
Another mitzvah or Tefillah itself? Tefillah itself. That's exactly what the Rav is saying. The fact that
the Rabbanan took that sort of more primal move towards davening, but they still structured it.
Correct. They structured it, but they didn't. Well, again, before the pasuk in Daniel, we have to go through 2 stages. The Havamina was that although they structured it and they required 3 and nothing less will do, on a daily basis I'm required minimally 3 tefillos, I can add a tefillah, but not a tefillas nedava. Again, don't fall into that trap. But rather a tefillas chova, a regular classic tefillah. Why? Because it's not the chovas gavra that sets up the Maisa Tefillah, the Chefza Shel Tefillah, the entity of Tefillah. It's the Rachamim, the fact that I feel now I have this inner need for Rachamim, for Rachmei Shamayim, for compassion for Hashem.
That's the Havamim. The Havamim falls there.
Correct.
I would have thought.
And not only that, it's also a little bit of a maskana in 2 ways. Number one, when I get up to daven, I should not say Hineni Muchan Bezuma Lakayim Mitzvahs Tefillah Shakadosh Baruch Hu Tzivausi. I'm not going to say Asher Kitchanu Mitzvosav Tzivanu L'Spalel, because once I do so, I've converted my tefillah into a keva, into a chovas gavra, but that's not really what it's all about. What it's all about is setting up a chefza shel tefillah without a chovas gavra.
But even the more bolei mitzvah within davening will be Krias Shma. And even there, the Berachos Krias Shma are not structured like a
regular Shirkin Shalom. It's also Mitzivanu.
Right.
And the second Afkamini says is Nashim. Women should not be obligated in tefillah because it's a mitzvah seishas man groma. Yet they are obligated. Tefillah, the Gemara says why? Because tefillah rachminu. So the Rav comes up with a brilliant insight into what it means tefillah rachminu. Why is a woman obligated in tefillah? Because the very fact that she can set up the tefillah, so you start with the chefta, then you add a chovas kavod. So anyone who has the potential, the power, the ability to create a chefta shel tefillah becomes obligated in tefillah. That's how it works.
Tefillah, we're calling what? Shmona Esrei?
Shmona Esrei, right. We're talking about Shmona Esrei.
So you're saying someone under bar mitzvah can also set up a
Correct.
Rachamim.
Correct. So
We don't count them as a minion.
Oh,
We
so
don't count them as
minion
a
is a different halach. Minion has to
We
do
don't count women
with-
towards minion also.
right. Minion has to do with an entity called Adas Yisrael. Adas Yisrael is made up of an Ada of 10 men who are obligated in mitzvahs. So that's another discussion.
So obligated mitzvahs generally, not necessarily obligated in tefillah. Then.
Correct. In general, they're obligated in mitzvahs, including mitzvah seishas man grom. But what's unique about the Rav, I want to just read to you his language here on page Mem. It's fascinating to me. He says, after having already established on page Lamed Tes, the previous page, that anyone who's already fulfilled his chiyuv cannot, in general in mitzvahs, could not possibly set up a ma'aseh mitzvah. Why? Because he says, al yidei chovas hagavra, Yotzer, he can create a chefta shel mitzvah. But here he says on Daf Mem that in the case of tefillah is a chefta shel rachamim, and eino mahava yechida shel keva. It's not really an entity of chova, and therefore yesh no chefta shel tefillah besuderes bebirchosera she'ena tluya klal b'chiyuv hagav. The chefta shel tefillah is not generated and not dependent upon the chiyuv gav. Hechsherin ovem heyos rachamim bifnei atzma v'afilu im adam kvar yotzi yidei chova selo poka chalos shem tefillah b'tor chefta shel rachamim. Klapelai, it's just the opposite. Chovas hagavra novas, the chiyuv gavra is a result of me'a'uvda shehi kayemes the he meaning tefillah is kayemes b'chefta b'mitzias. It's a chefta shel tefillah. And since women have a chefta shel tefillah, memela they have a chovas gavra, and therefore I should never set up my tefillah as a tefillah's keva. I should never say, "Well, now I'm going to daven because I'm obligated to daven." That's almost like an insult. You're davening because God gave you the opportunity for vakoshes rachamim, for a chefta shel rachamim. This, I think, is a major breakthrough. And again, this will answer our question about Birkas HaMazon. Birkas HaMazon, from that perspective, is purely about Chovas Gavra. And the Chefta Shel Bracha of Birkas HaMazon is a result of the Chovas Gavra. If you've already benched and you recited Birkas HaMazon and you fulfilled your obligation, there's no longer a Chovas Gavra, so you cannot create an entity of a Bracha. But in Tefillah, it goes the other way around. You start with the Chefta Shel Tefillah and Rachamim, and then you end up with the Chovas Gavra.
How would this all play into distinctions between Shachris Mincha versus Marav? With being a Chova versus Rishus?
In a certain sense, Ma'ariv supports what the Rav is saying because there's no Chovas Gavra, and yet there's a Tefillas Arvis. But again, you have to know there are different categories of tefillah. Something called tefillas rishus, and something called tefillas nedava. For example, Ma'ariv is not really technically a tefillas nedava, even though we pass in rishus. It's a rishus, but not nedava. You don't have to be machadish b'dava like you have to do it in nedava. But what I wanted to point out here is that what the Rav is doing for us is he's showing that there are two elements. It's so typical Brisk. There's the Chovas Gavra and then the Maisa Gavra, the Chovas Gavra and the Chefta. And what he's pointing out is that tefillah is unique in terms of the direction. Where do you start and where do you end? As far as the universal constellation of mitzvahs, you start with the Chovas Gavra, and that gives you the ability through your Chovas Gavra to set up a Maisa, a Chefta, a Maisa mitzvah. But in the case of tefillah, it goes in the reverse. And this is so radical because what the Rav is telling you now is that the universal principle that applies to all mitzvahs of mitzvahs tzrichas kavana has one exception. There's one mitzvah where adarabba, not kavana. Kavana means kavana lotzei sidei chovaso. That kavana lotzei sidei chovaso is in a certain sense antithetical to tefillah. It's the opposite of tefillah. What motivates my tefillah is the rachamim, is the tachnunim, is the hefta shel tefillah that I set up as a result of tachnunim. And if I go ahead and say, well, I'm going to daven now because I'm obligated to daven, then what happens is I'm taking tefillah and I'm robbing it of its very unique essence as a hefta shel rachamim, because I'm saying, I'm not davening because of rachamim, I'm davening because God told me. It's a very radical kind of understanding when you think of it in hashkafa terms, that according to Rav Soloveitchik, the whole issue of mitzvah svichas kavana, where a man says, well, I'm taking a lulav because God commanded me. I'm eating the matzah because God commanded me. No, I'm not davening because God commanded me. I'm davening because as a human being, I need rachamim. And then I set up a hefta shel tefillah. And that tefillah is a tefillah shel rachamim, which the Mishnah Nova says a person should always be mispal a tefillah shel rachamim and not a tefillah shel keva, meaning a tefillah shel chov.
And on a deeper level, it makes a lot of sense, because if you walk into davening saying, I have kavanah to be yotzei davening, right, to the mitzvah of davening, then you could just say Shema Yisrael, whatever, without kavanah, because you've had kavanah to say, meaning the kavanah is not in doing, not in davening, unlike a lulav. You have to have, what kavanah is there to shake a lulav? You have to have the kavanah for a mitzvah, otherwise,
Right.
What's the kavanah? Or any
Right.
mitzvah.
But keep in mind, Eli, that Reb Chaim is famous, and we discussed it at great length in the past, that in tefillah there are two kavanas. There's one kavana that applies to mitzvahs in general, and then there's another kavana of omed lifnei hashchina. You remember that?
Yes.
And that defines the ma'aseh tefillah. So what happens now, according to the Rav, is that we're really reducing it down to one. From two, we're reducing it to one. It's not the general mitzvah, the general rule or requirement of mitzvah strichas kavana. I'm not going to say, well, Hidni muchar mezuma l'kayim chovasi, but rather I'm going to create a hefta shel rachamim, and that is through the kavanah that I'm asking Hashem in front of Hashem for rachamim.
What I'm saying is that makes sense, because tefillah, you need kavanah for tefillah in of itself.
Right.
The whole point of tefillah
To
is
set up a
kavanah.
hefta shel tefillah.
Exactly, the kavanah is built into the
very essence of
not
the
onto the essence of tefillah.
Okay, now in your phones here, you should have likutei halachos. And what we're looking at is Hilchos Krias Shma.
So my question is then, how do you reconcile the pasuk? Meaning the pasuk in Daniel says, okay, you can't do more than three.
So when you get to the maskana,
but
so remind me, because of time constraints, we're going to have another shir for a half hour at least on how Brisk understands why the maskana you're only allowed 3 tefillahs. Okay. That has to do with a concept called a matir. Do you know what that means? A matir, in other words, who gives me license to stand in front of the Rebbeinu Shalom, and I'm like a fly on the back of a what do you call it? What's the largest mammal? What's it called? A whale? Not a whale. An elephant, right? I'm like a fly in the back of an elephant, and I'm going to ask Hashem for an audience with him, and I'm going to say to him, well, I need to pass an exam tomorrow. Help me pass an exam. Like, what a chutzpah, So that has to do with a matir, that the chovas gavra here is an element that sets up the matir. So what we're looking at here is on page 323. In Likutei Halachos, or Chaim, it's the 3rd volume, Hilchos Krias Shma, and it's Perek Daled, and it's paragraph Yud Beis. And I thought it would be appropriate to learn this because next week, on Tuesday, we have Asar B'Teves. Now, we identify Asar B'Teves with the siege of Nebuchadnezzar around Yerushalayim, but in truth, Chazal say that there are 3 days in Teves that form an entity, a progression, and we should really fast on all 3 days, just that we can't physically do so. And on the 8th of Teves, Ezra HaSofer died. On the 9th of Teves, Talmai HaMelech forced the Chachamim to translate the entire Tanakh into Yavanis, into Greek. And it was only on the 10th of Teves that the siege was set around Yerushalayim. And what the Likutei Halachos wants to do, Rabbi Nassan, and it's his yahrzeit now, so we should have it in mind, that Ilui Shma, is to combine and integrate these 3 days into one. Meaning the fast of Asar B'Teves is not just for the siege around Yerushalayim, but these 3 events, the death of Ezra and the translation of the Torah into Greek, together with the beginning of the Churban Abayis, all these 3 are integrated to form one whole. They're not separate, disparate segments, but rather they're part of a whole.
So
that's going to be his.
Because it's the last day, or because the Korban is the greater of the tragedy?
Because these 3 are part of a framework called Churban. In other words,
I understand, but so is it because they culminated on Yud?
On Yud is the beginning of the actual Churban. But what Rav Nassan is going to try to argue is that if you understand what Churban Abayis is all about, you'll understand that the death of Ezra and the translation of the Torah into Yavanis is all part of Churban, if we define Churban properly. That's his goal. Now, in order to appreciate how he achieves this goal, we should mention that we're already pages and pages into the 4th chapter of Hilchos Kriyas Shma, and in his introduction, Rabbi Nassan tells you that this chapter of Kriyas Shma is based on Likutei Maharan, Simon Lamed Vav 36, Bekrov Olai Mereim. Now, I would like to try to summarize at least 2, to highlight at least 2 of the points of Likutei Maharan, Simon Lamed Vav, Bekrov Olai Mereim. Point number 1 is to understand what a bracha is all about. What does the concept of bracha mean? When I say bracha, I'm not talking about a bracha, Baruch Atah Hashem. That's not what I'm referring to. The Nefesh HaChaim of Chaim Volozhin has a long discussion about what it means, Baruch Atah Hashem, but that's not what we're talking about here tonight. When we mean a bracha, we mean that the shefa, the spirituality and divinity that comes down from the heavens, can be received as a bracha. And that's not so simple. Why? Because in order to receive the shefa as a bracha, you need to turn it into a tsuras habracha. What does that mean? The R itself is abstract. It's undefined. It's what's called an R pashut. That R pashut could be received in one of 2 ways. It could be received as a klola or as a bracha. For example, when we get to Parshas Bilam in Mitzvah Shem Balak, we'll talk about Bilam. Bilam HaRasha wanted to make sure that that shefa, that R, which is pashut, when it came down here for Klal Yisrael, become a klal. That's what he wanted to do. I'll just read to you quickly one line here. It says, Hine barech lakachti uberech v'lo ashivenu. Bilam says, he declares, barech lakachti. The base of barech is a kamatz. Uberech v'lo ashivenu. But what happened at the end, although Bilam's initial intention was barech, the kamatz, God changed it from a kamatz to a tzere, uberech. And what's berech b'tzere? That his lekicha, he understood that what he could do is, because of his great, powers as a navi, he could take that R, b'kamatz. Kamatz means that it's susim, it's closed. It hasn't yet been defined. And he thought he could define it and make it into a tzura of a klola. That was his intention. But what if Hashem intervenes and he changes the komatz to a tsere, and the tsere represents to the tsura of a bracha. Now, how is it that Bilam expected to take this komatz and make it into a klola? He did so because his kli, his vessel to receive this bracha, is the vessel of what I'd call in Yiddish an oisvarf. Do you guys know what an oisvarf is? Yeah, I don't know how to translate it into English. An oisvarf is a person who's the lowest of the low. He is absolutely repulsive in every moral sense. And if you receive the bracha, which is undefined because it's a kamatz and it's an or pashut into a kli that is completely contaminated, it's absolutely disgusting. It reaches the lowest level. I don't know if you remember that Chazal say that Bilam had relations with his own donkey. I mean, that's how low he was. He was a real oisvarf. I can't explain that word oisvarf, but he's the lowest. And therefore that R would come down through Bilam as a klala. It would be received and take on the status of a klala. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu intervened, and he turned the komatz into a tzeira. What does that mean? That already up in Shamayim, the R took on a tsura. A tsura of what? Of a bracha. So that Bilam could not possibly take that tsura and convert it through his kalim tmeim into a klal, because it was already defined up in Shamayim. That was the great intervention of Hashgacha Pratis to save the Jewish people, the Rachmei Hashem, at the time of Bilam. Bilam was a very dangerous moment in Jewish history. There's a second point over here that is fundamental to the hashkafa, the philosophy of Rabbi Nosson, based on Rabbi Nachman. And that is Tikkun HaBris. I don't know if we've had occasion to talk about Tikkun HaBris here. Maybe yes, maybe no. Whatever it is, this is one of the most fundamental principles in Breslav. Now, in Breslav, we break down Taivas into three major pillars. Okay, there's Taivas Mammon, there's Taivas Kavod, and there's Taivas Niv, which is in the area between men and women. And Tikkun HaBris means to purify oneself in the area of Tikkun HaBris, of Taivas Niv. And Rabbi Nosson understands from his Rebbe that just like Bilam has what you call Kalim Tmeim, and he's going to turn that komatz into a klola, so to a Russia in this area of Tikkun HaBris, meaning he's far away from Tikkun HaBris, and he cannot control that area of Taivas Niv, and he's contaminated in that area, such a person will not be able to receive the R as a bracha. It automatically becomes a klol. And here's where Breslav introduces the power of the tzaddik. The power of the tzaddik is such that he can go all the way up to the highest levels where that R comes from, and he can convert it into a bracha, so that even someone who is so far away from Tikkun HaBris, whose kalim are kalim that are completely contaminated, can still receive a bracha. So that's the role of the tzaddik.
So there's an intervention.
Who is intervening now on behalf of the Russia? It's the tzaddik.
The case of Bilam was Hashem.
What do you say?
The case of Bilam was Hashem himself.
Correct. Because of Bilam's tremendous power.
I think this might relate to the minhag of wiping out the Kiddush cup before putting wine in it. Know that minhag? It's minhag Chabad.
You mean Shtifa Marika before?
No, with a napkin, you wipe the vessel before you put the wine in.
Maybe it's symbolic of being mitayar you.
Cleaning the vessel before it could be.
By the way, in Chabad, is there a philosophy called Tikkun HaBris? Does that appear? Because it's in Breslav, it's like every other paragraph.
I don't think.
Yeah, that's.
I think the concept.
It's Rav Nachman's thing, Tikkun HaBris is so central. In any event, he says now the following: V'zeu b'chinas asar b'teves. Hasholosh hatzoros she'eru b'teves. And you'll see it in the Slichos, the death of Ezra Sofer. Now, in emphasizing the death of Ezra Sofer, the word Sofer is critical. Ezra is the individual who embodies, he personifies Tikkun HaBris. Like Yosef HaTzadik, he personifies Tikkun HaBris, and he reaches the level of Tara, and this creates a Sefer Torah which has the ability to have a tremendous impact on those who study from that Sefer Torah. Because of the great sanctity and purity of Ezra, his Sefer Torah is very unique. The second thing that happened during Tevis, besides the death of Ezra, the loss of the possibility of Ezra as a scribe writing Sefer Torah, is the Torah being translated to Yavanis at the time of Talmud HaMelech. Finally, we end up with Churban Beis HaMikdash. Kulam heim bechina achas. Bechinas pagam. What's happening is these three events are the opposite of bracha. They represent pagam. Pagam is a blemish in the bracha. Hainu. Shekasha litzayer ha'or lebracha. We said that the or is an or with a kamatz. It's undefined. It is an or pashut, and it needs a tzura. And now our responsibility, our goal, our agenda is to create a tzira of an or lebracha. Take that or and give it a tzura of what? Of bracha. But it can't happen. Why not? Because of these three tzaros. Ezra died. He used to write a Sefer Torah. Because of his great Kedusha, when he wrote a Sefer Torah, the Kedusha Gedola, he could take the or that manifests itself or exists in the osios of the Torah and make them into an or of bracha. And therefore, when we study Torah from the Torah that was written, the Sefer Torah written by Ezra Sofer, we are inspired, we are uplifted by the bracha that's inherent in those osios. But now, now Ezra's gone. Is there anyone who can possibly create such a Sefer Torah? To make the osios jump with bracha, to be infested, to be penetrated with bracha? Nobody could really do that. We don't have an Ezra Sofer. V'lo die in the next paragraph that we cannot be mitzayer l'tova in the case of the Sefer Torah. Sheibadu Sofer, Shu Ezra Sofer, etc. Gam, it's worse than that. Because now who's writing the Torah? Who has the translation into Greek of the Torah? It's the Yevonim. Who are the Yevonim? The Yevonim are the hepach of Ezra Sofer. If Ezra Sofer is the manifestation of Kedusha and Tara, then the Yevonim are the manifestation of the lowest level of contamination. Whatever they did. I'm not going to go into a description of the Greek, lack of sexual morality, whatever you want to call it. And therefore, what happens to the Torah and its light and its osios when it is now being written by the Yevonim? The opposite of a bracha. Al yidei ksivasam v'hatokasam. Shemizeh nimshach. And now Reb Nachman, in the words of his Talmud, now sees these distorted kind of osios and hatokos haTorah as something that spreads out and has an impact on the entire world. And what is the result of this? Apikursus, v'kfirus, shalom achakrim, v'afilosofim. I think, in my humble opinion, he's referring to the Jewish philosophers and those who deny chas v'sholom the belief in God and in the Torah. Shemahapchim divrei Elokim chayim. They take divrei Elokim, they take the Torah Kedosha, and they convert it, transform it apikursus into kfiros. Rachmana litzlan, God should save us and spare us. And what is true about these apikursim? He's talking about the movement that's called Haskol. You're familiar with that? Is that they want to teach their children limud mikra bilvad. They want to teach them the Torah, the Tanakh, as Torah Shebechsav, believe Perish Rabboseinu Shebegmara Midrash V'Agados, without our Chachamim's interpretation. And what are these kelim of these apikorsim? We think of apikorsim only as some intellectual movement, to Hashem, deny the veracity of Torah and God and so forth. So no. The truth about these apikorsim is that they are mekulkolim upagumim mi'od al yidei ribui tavas niyuf. They are dedicated to tavas niyuf, to unlimited sexual pleasures. And a meshukayim ba, they are absolutely involved in that. Kamosha mefursam, and we know about them, that's what they were doing. Al kain ein rotzim shiasku b'nei b'gemara b'drashim shel Rabosenu. That would introduce kedusha and Tara into the osios of Torah. They don't want that. They can't tolerate that. They don't want to be mitzayir their Torah in terms of kedusha and Tara. V'zel b'chinas churban abayis. Now we reach the highest level on the 10th of Teves. Ki, what was the Beis Hamikdash about? What was the essence of the avodas hakohanim? They were mamshichim kol hashpos v'abrachos. What do the Kohanim have to do in the Beis Hamikdash? They mevarech the am. They bless us. Where do we see that the Kohanim enter into that or and give it a hemshech, a surah of bracha? It says v'kamatz hakohen. Right, the Kohen did the kmitza. What does that mean? The Kohen was able to look at the light and penetrate into that light that's kamutz, that's closed, and give it a tzura of bracha. Yesh lahem koach al yidei avodasam lahamshich haor b'bchinas kamatz litzerei. Tzerei is the tzura of bracha. They have the ability to transform the kamatz into a tzerei. Litzayro b'bchinas bracha. Shezel b'chinas birchas kohanim shemasar haTorah lahem levarach es Yisrael ki heim yicholim lahamshich haor min hakamatz litzerei litzayro lebracha. And then Rabbi Nosson goes on for pages and pages to describe the purpose of karbanos, and he explains why do we recite karbanos before Tefilla, and then we recite after the karbanos Krias, Shma, and Tefilla, and he says that this is the opportunity that we have through the karbanos to change our kelim, to upgrade them, to sanctify them and purify them, so that we can be mitzayer the kamatz into a tzerei and make the or into an or of bracha. And here Rabbi Nosson presents an entire thesis about the power and the umnus, the special ability of the chacham, of the tzaddik, with his chachma yisera, to do a tikkun on nafshos hapagumim, to have an impact on those nefashos that are so guilty of the opposite of tikkun abris, of taivas diuf, and their kelim are so pagumim, they're so contaminated, and somehow the tzaddik is able, through a great umnus, a tremendous power that he has, to create a tikkun even for the nafshos hapagumim, so they can receive the bracha. And without the tzaddikim, einav yachol litvos diburo shel tzedakah. If not that the tzaddik was able to achieve this great feat, these rishoyim, these people who are so entrenched and dedicated to taivas niyuf, and their nefashos are so full of pagam, they can't listen to the dibur of the tzaddik. They haven't prepared themselves with tikkun abris, which is tikkun amochim, in order to receive the Orat Torah. Okay. Therefore, tzorach hatzadik l'tachbulos rabos mi'od. Does anybody here know what the word tachbulos means? Tricks, exactly. To do it b'harama. And this reminds me of a famous story about Rabbi Nachman Breslav. Rabbi Nachman had his opponents, and they looked for ways of trying to deride him. So there's a story in one town, I forget the name of the town, but the town was known as a town full of apikorsim. And they found Rabbi Nachman playing chess with three of the greatest apikorsim in that town. And of course, those who wanted to deride him say, "Oh, look at this! You call him your Rebbe? He's playing chess with these three." But these are what you call tachbulos. Tachbulos means that the tzaddik is able to go to climb and achieve where he disguises the Torah in a way that you couldn't recognize that this is Torah. And by doing so, he's able to impact even on Rishon. What do you say? Checkmate. Hatzadik yochel l'tzayer ha'or. Now the tzaddik has the ability to climb all the way up to the Ar Pashut. L'mala, b'makom she'ein yad haklipos v'sitra achos sholtim sham. On that high level, the Ar is purely divine and it's Pashut, but he can now get all the way up to that level, take that Ar, and give it a tzur, a tzura of a tzera, of a bracha, such that now it can be received down even by the Kalim Pgumim, just like we said before, that although Bilam's agenda was to receive the Ar in his Kli Pagum, but nevertheless, if Hashem would be Mitzayer, that surah up in Shomayim and make it into a tzur bracha, then it could be received even in the worst Kalim. And Bilam was going to receive those brachos for Klal Yisrael. And likewise, in the case of the tzaddik, he too has that power to go all the way up on high and convert that Ar into an Ar that's mitzuyar as a bracha. V'yaz yachal lahamshich ha'ar misukan u'mitzuyar l'tova l'mata ad shelo yuchlu hapgam shel keleim lekalkel ha'ar. They can't convert that Ar into a klola by receiving it in their kelim pagumim, because they're pagum in taivas niyuv. They can't do so because it's already got a tzir and a tzura before it comes down. Who can achieve such a tremendous goal? Only the tzaddik. And now I'd like to fast forward to Tes Vav, which is on page 326. Do we have another 5 minutes?
Yep.
Let me just see. Yeah, I think we have 5 minutes. In Torah Lamed Vav that we mentioned at the beginning, it's clear that Kriyat Shma im dmos machniim taivas niyuf legamre. So Rabosai, if you'll ever become a Breslav chassid, this is what you want to achieve. That when you say Shma Yisrael, and especially Baruch Shem Kvod Malchuso, you break down in tears. We live in a generation where it's very, very difficult and challenging to cry. But if we can only do so, then al pi chassidus, those tears will subjugate and defeat taivas niyuf legamre. V'alkein zeh sheragel b'rehurim chas v'sholom, a person who very often has thoughts about a woman and so forth and so on, tzarich livkos b'shas kriyat shma. He should be crying at the type of kriyat shma. And I would like to note here for my own self that if you look in the Likutei Halachos in Hilchos Bris Milah, which Bris Milah is all about Tikkun HaBris and overcoming Taivas Niyuv, then at the time of Bris Milah, the child breaks down in cries. And those tears of the child represent the attempt to defeat the Sitra Achra and those powers that are trying to bring down a person into Taivas Niyuv. So what is Machnia Taivas Niyuv? It's Dmos. It's tears. And when a person recites Kriyat Shma, he accepts upon himself the oneness of Hashem. He creates what we call the Heftzah Shel Kriyat Shma in Brisk terminology. That itself is going to bring about a Hachna of Taivas Niv. And Zeu Sod, now we get to Parshas Vayigash, our Parsha this week. Vayevk al Tzavarav Od. At the meeting between Yosef and his father Yaakov, Yosef breaks down in tears. Amu Rabbi Seidim, what was Yaakov doing at that moment when Yosef fell on his father's neck and cried? Yaakov oz hayakore Kriyat Shma. Yaakov was involved in Kriyat Shma. What is going to happen after Yaakov goes down to Mitzrayim? What epical part of Jewish history is going to begin with Yaakov going down to Mitzrayim? Golus Mitzrayim. Golus Mitzrayim is all about Taivas Niv. It's all about Ervas Ha'oretz, if you remember that phrase. Ervas Mitzrayim. And Klal Yisrael can now be challenged with the greatest challenge of Taivas Niuv in the exile in Mitzrayim. Yaakov Avinu, as he's going down to Mitzrayim, and at the moment that he meets Yosef, is going to be involved in reciting Krias Shma. Why? Why Krias Shma at that moment? You're about to be rejoined with your son Yosef, and now you're busy with Krias Shma? Give it a break. But Zeh Bechinas Hasod Hanal, what Yaakov Avinu wants to establish at the moment of Krias Shma is the ability to subjugate and overpower Taivas Niuv, because we're about to go down to Mitzrayim. We need, because the Sitra Achra of Niuv in Mitzrayim is so powerful, we need to somehow overcome that Taivas Niuv. And what does Yosef do? Bechinas Bechia. Yosef breaks down in tears. He too joins together with his father Yaakov, the Krias Shma of Yaakov, together with the Bechia of Yosef, forms one entity. And what is the nature, the essence of that entity? Levatel Taivas Niuv, the crying and the tears of Yosef. And only someone like Yosef could achieve such a high goal that would have an impact on Klal Yisrael. As the Gemara tells us that during the time of Golus Mitzrayim, we were outstanding in this area of Niuv, of sexual morality. We reached in unbelievable levels in that place of Ervas Haaretz. And what does it say about Noshim Tzidkonios? That they did so much for their husbands, and they were so dedicated and loyal to their husbands. Levatel Taivas Niuv Shu Ra HaKolel. Ra HaKolel means that Rabbi Nachman classifies the essence of Ra as beginning with Taivas Niuv. Unbelievable. There's almost like an obsession with this topic of Taivas Niuv.
Dafka didn't descend to the lowest places in that area?
Not in that area. Chazal say in that area, the men were clean, the women were clean. There was one woman who was raped by a Mitzri. What was her name? Who remembers her name? And she gave birth to the Megadef, right? Because he had an Egyptian father and a Jewish mother. I forgot her name right now. Sorry, it just slipped my mind. But in any event, that was just a choreg. That was a Yotzei Dofen. So it means Ki Yaakov Yosef kechada chashiva. That's a quote from the Zohar. Habachia shel Yosef, haKriyas Shma shel Yaakov nechshav li echad. There's an integration here of Kriyas Shma with Bechia. Kriyas Shma, in which a person rises to the level of being misached b'yichud gomur with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem Echad, and that's going to overcome the Taivas Niuv and the Baruch Shem Kvod Malchuso, the crying. At that moment, all that integrates. V'zeh hoye b'shas knisas Yaakov b'shivim nefashos l'golus Mitzrayim. The Ikar HaGolus hoye b'chinas hanal. The Ikar HaGolus was all about Taivas Niuv. Umashe tzrichim hanefashos shel bais Yaakov, the 70 nefashos need lehitz tarif. Tzirif means catharsis, to be cleansed, to be purified. Lisnasos, so they could withstand the temptation, the challenge of Golus shel shivim umos v'tavosein. Because Chazal tell us that Mitzrayim represents all shivim umos. All the Golios really are inherent in Golus Mitzrayim, and they therefore encompass all of Taivas Niuv, which is called Taiva Klolos. That's why you may know that the Breslavers recite what's called the Tikkun HaKloli. The Tikkun HaKloli is meant, and Rab Nachman worked very hard to come up with the Tikkun HaKloli. It's a direct legacy from Rabbi Nachman of Breslav. And the Tikkun HaKloli, they have pamphlets if you see it, is meant to be a tikkun for the Taiva Klolos. So the Taiva Klolos needs a Tikkun Kloli. And the Taiva Klolos is the Taiva of Niuv, which is at the center of all Taivas. Shezo b'chinas Golus Mitzrayim. Alkein oz b'eis knisosam. When the 70 nefashos come down into the 70 umos, into Mitzrayim, representing the 70 umos, into the makom of Sitra Achra, of Taivas Niuv, they need to recite Krias Shma. They need to be machnia that Taiva of Taivas Noshim. And Yosef is continue to cry on the shoulders of his father, to continue that tikkun, because he realized that we're entering into Zuamas Mitzrayim, and we need the tikkun of Bechil. And from here on, which we don't have time for tonight, Rabbi Nosson discusses what's called sadness and why we need to overcome sadness. And Bechia has an unbelievable power to break up Mora Shchora, any sort of depression. And that depression itself, that Mora Shchora, is really nothing more than a manifestation of Taivas Niv. When a person feels overwhelmed by Taivas Niv and he cannot fulfill Niv, no matter how much he tries, he'll never be able to satiate himself. He goes into a state of Mora Shchora, which is the opposite of Simcha. And Yosef HaTzadik, through his persistent, I should say, Bechia, is going to be overcome. He's going to be able to overcome the Taivas Niv. And that's typical, a manifestation of the essence of Yosef, who, when he gets faced by the challenge of that Shivcha Bisha, that lowlife of Eshes Potiphar, Kovash es Yitzra, he was able to be Kovash es Yitzra. And that's because of Yosef's great level of Tikkun Bris, of that manifestation of being a tzaddik in that area that allows him to cry tears that have the ability inherently to be machnia taivas niv, and especially at that critical moment of shivim nefesh yardu avoseinu b'mitzrayim. Yiratzon will be zocha on this asara b'teves to overcome all these issues, all these challenges that want to introduce Kalim Tmeim, the Kalim Tmeim of the Yevonim, and drag us down, that we should have a dedication, an absolute love for Torah, for Tefillah, for Tshuva, for Avodas Hashem, especially in the areas of Krias, Shma, and Tefillah, to come close to Hashem, to overcome those impurities, to create for ourselves not Kalim Pegumim Chas v'Shalom, but Kalim Kedoshim Utahorim, such that we can now receive the Or Pashut as a tzera, not as a komatz, in a tzir of bracha, and that will bring about the Geula Shleima from here of Yameinu.
Amen.
Thank you so much.
Wow.
There's so much here, it's just endless. Okay, then, Rabosai, so let me wish you a Shabbat Shalom. What do we have this Shabbos? We have Parshas Vayigash. So when you get to the pasuk about Yaakov saying Krias Shma and Yosef falling and crying on his father's shoulders, you'll hopefully remember some of the Torah that we learned tonight. Okay, then? Okay, it's